when I say leadership, it doesn't apply only to the one head of the organization. It's the top group of any organization. That's the leadership. If you have a board, that's part of the leadership. If you have a management team or set of officers, that's the leadership of the organization. So we know from experience that that effective leaders pull their organizations together towards the goals, and they have good programming and activities, and they're able to sustain their work. We also know that ineffective leaders unglue the organization at times. So this we know from experience. The other point, that's another abiding truth about organizations, is that it is so integral to building the capacity and the high quality performance of organizations. Having said both of those truths, the third thing is that you can't do it alone. We can't do it alone. We need other people to work with us to move our agendas forward. Now, there was a study done by the Center for Creative Leadership. It was done in 2007. And one of the things that they found out, now they're talking about effective future leaders, but since this was 2007, it's now 2013. The future is now, okay? So what we need now as effective leaders, they found out 4 best practices. One is collaboration. That was the foremost skill that leaders need to be effective in their organizations. Second is managing change. Third is building effective teams. And fourth is using influence without authority. It means, but what that means, and I'll go into that a little bit more, is that most of our authority comes from our position, what they call positional power. But we don't have positional power over everybody. Okay? So we have to influence people who don't, on whom we don't have some official authority. And so it's important to be able to influence them through other ways. And that's one of the key skills, best practices around effective leadership. So if you notice, these are not the traditional control and command kind of skills that are working these days. What is really important is a much more collegial type of leadership, if you will. So I was thinking about, our communities here in New York and New Jersey. What all this research and facts about leadership really means is that for you to be successful as leaders in the community, that you have to imbibe and exercise those practices for your organizations to be successful and for you to have an impact on the well-being of the community here. Now, how many of you are 501c3s? Oh, more than I thought. Okay. And how many of you are organizations whose focus is focused on activities for the benefit of Filipinos back home? Okay. And so the others have activities that are for the community here?
Yes.
All right. Okay. I just want to get a sense of the room. But it really doesn't matter because a lot of these things do apply.
Group of professionals.
Sorry?
And group of professionals.
Yes, right. Yeah. So I would like to propose, and this is not in the literature, this is my own thinking. I'd like to propose that your leadership responsibility really falls into 3 areas. One is to understand, have a strong grasp of the landscape of Filipino Americans in the New York, New Jersey area. That it's important that you have a feel for where do we stand among other immigrant groups and the mainstream society in our community. Second, that that you have a good grasp of the 4 anchors of effective organizations, and I'll describe that shortly. The third is that you have a responsibility to give a collective voice to Filipino Americans in our community. And I was thinking of a group in Chicago whose name is Afire. I think it's the empowerment. It's an empowerment group. It has to do with voter registration. Is one of the things that they do. But they've been working for so many years now, and they got to a point where Senator Durbin spent 2 hours with them. This is just for the Filipino American community. Usually we get lumped into the Asian American community. This was just with the Filipino American community, and he spent 2 hours with them, listening to them about the issues of the Filipino Americans in the greater Chicago area. They were very much for immigration reform, and so these are the kinds of decision making that affects all of us, and we could have a voice. And even if we don't want to be citizens, even if we're not even a green card holder, we live here, and therefore the policies and the legislation that elected officials and appointed officials make affect us. So we want to give voice to the needs of the community. So let me go back to the first point about the landscape of Filipino Americans in the New Jersey area. I just pulled together a few things from the census. Oh, sorry. All right. So we used to be the 3rd largest Asian American group in the New York, New Jersey area. There was a large influx of Koreans in the last few years, so we've now dropped to 4th place. But if you notice, we're still among the top 4, and the next largest one, the Pakistanis, the gap is large, 200,000 to 83,000. So there's a big gap. So we are among the top 4 largest Asian American ethnic group in this area, which means we could have a voice. Okay? So that's one asset that we have. Now there are both assets and challenges here. We have among the lowest poverty rates for children. However, it has just moved up. So although it's low, it went up 4% in the last census. I mean, you could, if you want to look more deeply into this, you can go to the census website and you can go into Asian Americans and you'll find more information about that. So if you're interested in working in this area, that would be one thing that you could do. Now, citizenship and voting age. This is an asset. Asians tend to naturalize and participate, and therefore participate in some of the activities in the community. However, Asians are also doesn't have a very high voting percentage, and we give reasons about being busy, or we don't speak English well, or which is actually not true, because we have very low what's called limited English proficiency, meaning we are high in English proficiency. So I raise this issue only in that this is one way that we could give voice. But of course, you don't have to be, as I said, you don't have to be a citizen, or you don't even have to vote to give voice to your concerns and needs. However, if you remember that the officials look at this data, and they look at the numbers. Okay? Employment, we are among the top employed groups, and in fact, Filipinos, if you look at the second bullet, it's the highest labor force in the city. Um, and that's an asset again. So why is it important to understand where we stack, how we stack up? It's because this is what decision makers look at. It's the data that they see, and therefore, if they feel that we have the numbers but we are not representing ourselves, then we are not going to be heard, and we won't matter as much. But I think it's important to think of this as kind of just as a backdrop for our activities. So let's go back now to my second point, which is much more directly relevant to leadership. Ensuring that your organizations have the 4 anchors of effective community organizations. Now, CRE, where I work now, is a consulting firm that specializes in nonprofit organizations. So we see about 250 to 300 nonprofit organizations every year. And so now it's 30 years old. We have a collective depth in understanding the needs and the challenges of nonprofit organizations and community organizations, and what works and what doesn't work. And what we have found out is that the 4 things that really matter is solid visionary leadership, effective programming and activities. In other words, if the programs don't produce results, if they don't matter. In other words, there is in the nonprofit world, there's a term called social value, or what they call your value proposition. So each organization has a mission or a purpose, and that's your reason for being. And if you don't get to that, then your value proposition is lost. Okay? And so it's important to make sure that your programs are working effectively, efficiently, and it's getting to the results that you say you want to achieve. And third is capable people and also the right structure and systems. And fourth is financial strength and resource allocation. That really refers to financial management and fundraising. And I think this afternoon you're going to have 2 sessions. One on financial management and one on events planning. Now, of course, events planning is only one type of fundraising, but I think most of our organizations rely on events planning, like we have galas to raise funds. But there are many, many other ways of raising funds. You know, fee for service, of course, government contracts, foundation grants, individual giving. I mean, you could name a dozen of different ways to raise money for your organizations. But I'll go back to leadership, which was what I was asked to talk about. So I want to go back to this result of the Center for Creative Leadership study and talk about this 4. Collaboration. There's this interesting framework that represents a number of best practices. In this framework, what it's saying is that you get to collaboration by building agreement and trust. Okay. Now, people who agree with us and we trust are called our allies. And there are certain strategies that we need to use to keep allies, because you could lose allies, okay? And I'll get to that. Let me just finish the framework. Then there are people who we don't quite trust for one reason or another, but we happen to agree on a certain issue, and those are called bedfellows. Now, there are a lot of those in Washington, right? A lot of bedfellows there. then you have people who we trust, but we happen not to agree on one issue. And those are called opponents. And the thing we have to be careful about is because someone doesn't agree with us, we then move them to become adversaries. Okay. So having a disagreement doesn't necessarily mean that you can't work with the person or that you cannot be collaborators. It's knowing where you stand in this framework. There are strategies for addressing all these four. So with allies, you want to keep them close. You want to affirm the relationship. You want to affirm that the agreement, the common purpose, the fact that you trust each other. With bedfellows, you want to maintain the respect. You want to focus on what you agree on. And you want to work out the areas where there is a lack of trust. And usually that tends to be in the areas of process and role. Meaning, oh, she did this last time, I don't think I can trust her, or this is the way she does things, I don't know if I can work with her. The thing is then to focus on that and have a dialogue about that and say, how can we work better together? We agree on these things, but how can we work better together? Okay. What role should we have? What process should we use? Etc. So that's the strategy for dealing with bedfellows. And by the way, if you want to read more about this came from the book called The Empowered Manager by Peter Block. It's one of the chapters in that book. Very interesting book. Then with opponents, as I said earlier, because we disagree with them, we trust them, right? But once they disagree with us, we say, oh my goodness, maybe I can't trust this person because he or she doesn't agree with me. But the point is that you want to keep the trust. You want to affirm the trust and find out why it is you disagree. So you state your position and listen to the position of the other person and see if you can if you can have some common ground between you, if you can find the common ground between you. Now with the adversaries, by the way, if we don't handle bedfellows and opponents well, they could become adversaries. Okay? So we have to be careful about those two. With adversaries, at least Peter Block's suggestion is, don't try to destroy them. Leave them alone. I mean, in other words, you don't trust them, you don't agree, you can't work with them, just let it be. Okay? But don't exert, it's like banging your head against the wall on adversaries. It's not productive. And then, of course, there are the last group here is the fence-sitters. Okay? And here, there is some level of trust and some level of agreement, but you don't quite know. And so Peter Block is saying, smoke them out, meaning just find out more about where they stand, and nudge them gently into taking a position. As I said, if you want to read more on this, it's a very interesting chapter. And if you have questions later, we can discuss this. So let's move on to this notion of conflict. In any collaboration, and any time we work together, there will always be conflict. Lahat tayo have experienced some level of conflict or disagreement. It's the question of how we handle it. So the point is not to avoid the conflict, but to learn how to manage it. Now there's a spectrum, a continuum. On one end is artificial harmony. That's, oh yeah, we're all agreed, no, walang problema, it's all kind of under the rug. But eventually, these kinds of issues will come up. So it will bubble up, and before you know it, it's another cycle of conflict. So artificial harmony, although it's comfortable at the beginning, it's not the long-term or even mid-term approach to take. And the other end, of course, is mean-spirited personal attacks out in the open, which you don't want to get into, because it's the other end of the spectrum. Now, there is in the middle what is called ideal conflict point, because when there is disagreement and conflict, people can come up with creative ideas that you can build on each other's ideas, and in the disagreement, you can find that there might be better ways of doing things. So there is, it's hitting that ideal conflict point rather than avoiding it that helps us use conflict as a leverage. So you will notice that it's constructive on the left side, and then once you go over that ideal conflict point, it becomes destructive, and then you're down into a spiral of never-ending conflict. So there are strategies that, again, you can use, or practices that you can apply to make sure that you're not just agreeing what they call pro forma, but that there's real agreement in the group. And when we look at the team, building effective teams, we're going to go into some of those practices. So here are just some suggestions, strategies. Came from the book called Managing Conflict, From the Inside Out. So distinguish between principles from preferences. Okay. So sometimes we want to use blue instead of red because we prefer blue. Okay. But that's not a principle, right? I mean, the principle might be that that the goal of the project is this, and that's because it is aligned with what we're trying to do. Okay. That's our principle. Our principle is we have to treat each other equally, let's say. I'm just using these as examples. That's different from, let's arrange the table this way, or let's have the parade this way. I mean, you know, those are more preferences. So you don't want to dig in your heels on the preferences, but you want to stand on your principles and try and convince others, or at least come to common grounds and principles. Reality test expectations. All that means is if you have an idea, you might want to present it as, what do you think of this? Is this something that you think might work? Okay. Rather than presenting it as a fait accompli, yung wala nang diskusyon. Okay? So it's presenting it differently. Move away from discussion of motives. So when we disagree with someone, or when we have a conflict, we tend to, in our heads, although we don't say it, we tend to assign a motive to the other person, that this person is doing this because she's trying to put me down, or because she wants to do this, or so move away from the motive part and just talk about the situation, look at the situation. It helps to sometimes keep quiet and just delay your response so that you don't come out with something you might regret, saying something you might regret, or something that's not thoughtful, something that's not rational. And then reflect also on what the conflict is about, and why you are reacting the way you are reacting. Okay. Now, if everybody did this, then hopefully we can all manage conflict better. Now, this is, by the way, is different from what we call negotiations, because that's a whole different area of work. Okay? So I'm not talking about negotiations, I'm just talking about differences, conflict. All right, let's now move into the second skill area called managing change. There is a difference between change and transition. Okay. Change is something external. So we're now going to have a new database. We're now going to have a new manual. We're now going to have a new office setup. Okay. Though that's external, it's what's seen, it's very outcome-oriented. The transition is how people feel about the change, what they're experiencing. A classic example for this is the change from typewriters to computers. And a lot of secretaries, by the way, the word secretaries is hardly used now. But you know, some secretaries felt that, are we changing because you don't like the way I was typing, or wasn't I typing effectively? So it's more personal. That's the transition that they're having from typing on a typewriter to using the computer. So it's very personal, it's process-oriented. Change is about the destination. We are here, we want to get there. That's change. Transition is the journey. It's moving from A to B or A to F, whatever that journey is. And so understanding the journey is very important. So you could be talking to people about the change that you want to make, but if you don't address how they're experiencing the change, then there will be resistance to the change. And there's a lot written on this topic. So one of the things that research has found is that change is both rational and powerful emotional components. And people perceive danger and opportunities. Now, if people perceive more opportunities, there would be less resistance. If they perceive more threats, then they will be, if they perceive more opportunities, they will be with you. If they perceive more threats, then they will be resistant. And then emotions show up sometimes as resistance, or there's also something called passive-aggressive resistance. So it may not look like they're resisting, but they're not doing anything. So that's a form of resistance as well. And that transition has to be managed effectively, and engaging the people affected by the change is important. So if, as heads of organizations, you're introducing a new program, a new activity, the people who are most effective have to be part of that discussion from the very beginning as much as possible, so that they feel part of the process. So they build ownership. There's this saying that it's not so much that we're afraid of change or in love with the old ways, but it's that we fear being in between the trapeze, you know, and I don't think any of us have been on a trapeze, but you can imagine the feeling between one and two trapezes. And Linus in Charlie Brown holding his blanket, that's his security. So it's without that blanket, they're feeling insecure. So that's the feeling that people get in that transition phase. You might experience this at work, but this could happen in your organizations as well. Now there is a model which has really been very useful in our consulting work by William Bridges. And when we change something, okay, like let's go back to that secretary, okay. For the people who introduce the computer in the office, they're excited about it, and to them it's the beginning of something. But for the secretaries who are moving from typewriter to computer, it's the ending of something. The end of using the typewriter. And so they feel some level of loss about that. And there will be a bit of productivity would be a bit low before it goes back up. And they're not excited about the computer. And they might also leave. Actually, some people in changes, like major changes, might leave the organization because of like restructuring and things like that. Might leave. And then the next stage is, so this is called the ending zone. Okay, people who are affected by the change start with ending. Okay, not the people who initiated the change, but the people affected by it are starting at the end zone. And then there's what's called the neutral zone.